Surviving Titanic did not always mean escaping the disaster. For some people, survival became its own trial. They were questioned, mocked, shamed, accused of cowardice, or turned into symbols of everything people thought had gone wrong that night. But here's the question I want to ask today. Why did some Titanic survivors become villains in the public imagination, while others were allowed to simply be survivors? After a disaster, people do not only search for facts, they search for meaning. And sometimes, when the facts are too complicated or too painful, they search for villains. You're listening to History Beneath the Surface, a Titanic-centered podcast exploring the true stories, mysteries, and meaning behind the Ship of Dreams.
I'm Kaylee. My educational background is in criminal justice and family therapy, and I've been a lifelong Titanic enthusiast. I've also had the privilege of working alongside leading Titanic experts during my time at RMS Titanic Inc., the company behind Titanic the Artifact exhibition and the stewards of the artifacts recovered from the wreck site. Here, I share what I've learned, what I'm still researching, and the stories that make Titanic's history so deeply relevant more than a century later.
While there's plenty of examples of so-called villains to pull from, today we're going to look into 3 specific case studies. The infamous Millionaires Lifeboat, Lifeboat number 1, that launched with only 12 occupants. Among those 12 were first-class passengers Cosmo and Lucy Duff-Gordon, accused of bribery and leaving those in need behind. The White Star Line director J. Bruce Ismay, whose name was dragged through the mud and turned into a newspaper tagline. Was he really the villain the movies have made us believe? And the only Japanese passenger on board, Masabumi Hosono, who returned home to shame and became a national example of cowardice.
So if we're asking why some Titanic survivors became villains, I think the answer is something we've all thought about before. Sometimes survival just looked too much like privilege. And no story carried that accusation heavier than Emergency Lifeboat number 1. Because if there was still one story that seemed to confirm the public's worst fears about Titanic, that wealth and power could protect you even in the middle of a disaster,
it was the story of Sir Cosmo Duff-Gordon, Lady Lucy Duff-Gordon, and the so-called Millionaires Lifeboat, or as it was also remembered, the Money Boat. Let's set the scene. Sir Cosmo Duff-Gordon was a wealthy British baronet, an Olympic fencer, and very much the image of an upper-class Edwardian gentleman. He was traveling with his wife, Lady Lucy Duff-Gordon, better known professionally as Lucille. And Lucille is such an interesting character. You might remember her briefly referenced in the 1997 Titanic movie as the woman who designs naughty lingerie. And yes, that was part of her reputation, but she was also much, much more than that. Lucille was one of the most successful fashion designers of her time, and she built that career after a very difficult start. By the time she met Cosmo, Lucy was divorced and the mother of 1 child, which was already socially complicated in Edwardian high society. Her first marriage had left her in a financially vulnerable position, so to support herself and her daughter, she started a dressmaking business. And it turned out, fashion design and entrepreneurship was exactly what she excelled at. Her business took off. She became known for soft, romantic, luxurious designs, and her fashion house grew into an international name. So when she married Cosmo Duff-Gordon in 1900, it was not just a romantic match. It was also a partnership between 2 people who understood wealth, status, and business. For a rare occasion, the couple traveled together on Titanic. They were joined by Lucille's secretary, Laura, often called Franks. And here is one of those strange little details. They were traveling under the names of Mr. and Mrs. Morgan. I have seen this described as them traveling incognito, but the exact reason is one of those details people still debate. Maybe privacy, maybe business, maybe just wealthy people weirdness. If you have more research on that, please drop it in the comments because I would genuinely love to know more about this. When Titanic struck the iceberg on April 14, 1912, the impact woke Lady Duff-Gordon. She later described the sound as something deeply unusual, almost like a large hand playing bowls along the side of the ship. Then Titanic's engine stopped. Soon after, Laura came to wake the Duff-Gordons and told them that water had entered her cabin and that people were being ordered to put on life belts. The 3 made their way up to the boat deck, and this is where the controversy around their survival really begins. Emergency Lifeboat number 1 was on the starboard side of Titanic. It was one of the small emergency cutters, and it had a capacity of about 40 people. But when it left Titanic, it carried only 12. 5 passengers and 7 crew. Sounds crazy, right? But before we jump straight to clutching our pearls, let's try to understand how that could happen. Lifeboat number 1 was located near the forward part of the boat deck on the starboard side. By the time it was being prepared, First Officer William Murdoch was overseeing boats on that side of the ship. Murdoch is often associated with a more flexible interpretation of women and children first. On the starboard side, if there were no women and children nearby, men were sometimes allowed into the boats. By this point, Titanic was clearly in serious trouble. People were moving around the decks trying to understand what was happening, and many passengers were naturally drifting farther aft, away from the rising water at the bow. There were also more lifeboats still to launch, so lifeboat number 1, sitting forward and not surrounded by a large crowd, seems to have been overlooked in the chaos. When Cosmo asked if he, his wife, and their party could get into the boat, Murdoch was happy to allow them in. Cosmo, Lucy, Laura, 2 other first-class passengers, and 7 crew members boarded Lifeboat 1 with no crowd immediately waiting to fill it. And with so many more boats still needing to be launched, the boat was lowered with only 12 people inside. So far, that explanation may sound a little more reasonable than the legend makes it seem. Still uncomfortable though? Absolutely. But not necessarily sinister. So where does this story get bad? Well, let me tell you. As Lifeboat number 1 rowed away from Titanic, the people inside were in an incredibly strange social situation. You had wealthy first-class passengers sitting in a boat with crewmen, especially stokers, men who, under normal circumstances, probably never would have sat and talked with as equals. They wouldn't have even crossed paths in normal circumstances. And during that time in the boat, a conversation came up. The crewmen talked about how they had lost their kits, their belongings, and their wages. Their pay stopped when the ship went down, and they had lost the clothing and tools they depended on. According to Sir Cosmo, he promised to help compensate them, and when they reached New York, he followed through, and he gave the men money. Now, on one hand, you can look at this as an act of compassion, but now think about how that looked to the outside world. An almost empty lifeboat did not go back to pick up people from the water. Wealthy first-class passengers were inside of it, and money was given to crew members afterwards. To many people, including the newspapers, that did not look like kindness. It looked like a bribe. The accusation was devastating, that Sir Cosmo Duff-Gordon had paid the crew not to row back toward the people crying out in the water. And this is where the Duff-Gordon story becomes a perfect example of how a survivor becomes a villain in the public imagination.
Because the public didn't need the whole story to be proven. The image of it was enough. A rich man in a nearly empty lifeboat with money exchanging hands while hundreds of people died, there was plenty of pain and fault to pass around. The Duff-Gordons were accused of cowardice, selfishness, and abandoning their fellow passengers. The press scrutiny became so intense that both Lady Duff-Gordon and Sir Cosmo Duff-Gordon were called to testify, and it became one of the most talked about scandals during the inquiries.
But here's the important part. The bribery accusation was investigated, but it was not proven. The British inquiry found that the charge that Sir Cosmo had bribed the men to row away from the drowning people was unfounded. That does not mean Lifeboat 1 was handled perfectly, it does not mean that the boat should have left with only 12 people, and it does not erase the horror of knowing that there was space in that boat while people were dying in the water. But it does mean that the simple version, rich people bought their survival, is not the most historically accurate way to remember it. The Duff-Gordon story is not simple. It's a story about class, fear, rumor, trauma, and terrible optics. It's about how an action that may have been intended as generosity could look monstrous when placed against the backdrop of mass death. And that is how a rumor became a legacy.
Because once Lifeboat number 1 was known as the Millionaires Lifeboat, that title was a lot easier to remember than the nuance of the situation. But class was not the only thing that could turn a Titanic survivor into a villain. Sometimes the problem wasn't just that you survived, it was what people thought that survival said about your integrity. And sometimes your manhood. Throw in the notorious yellow journalism running rampant, and you've got one stew of a story.
And that brings us to J. Bruce Ismay, the villain most often portrayed as the main antagonist in most dramatizations of Titanic. Because if the Duff-Gordons became infamous because their survival looked like privilege, Ismay became infamous because his survival looked, to many people, like a failure of his masculinity. He was not just judged for getting into a lifeboat. He was judged for not performing the role people expected of a man from his position. And that role was very clear in 1912. A man was supposed to be calm, stoic, self-sacrificing, protective, and willing to die before women and children. Especially if that man was wealthy. especially if that man was powerful and especially if that man represented the company that owned the ship. J. Bruce Ismay was the chairman and managing director of the White Star Line, the company that owned Titanic. He was not technically Titanic's owner in the simple way that people often say, because White Star Line was part of a bigger company, but he was one of the most visible and powerful company figures connected to the ship. So when Titanic sank, he became more than just one survivor. He became a symbol and a lightning rod. To the public, Ismay was not just Bruce Ismay in a lifeboat. He was the White Star Line in a lifeboat. Why was he allowed to live when so many others had perished? And in the aftermath of the disaster, that image became unforgivable. Because from the beginning, the Titanic story very quickly became a story about heroism. Men stepping back, women and children going first, husbands saying goodbye and officers keeping order, the band plays until the end and engineers staying below, Captain Smith disappearing with the ship. Those who died, especially the men who stayed calm, essentially did what they were supposed to do. Whether every one of those stories is perfectly clean or not, that was the moral framework that people wanted. A good man stayed and a good man protected. He sacrificed. And if he survived, people wanted to know that there was a reason. That is why Ismay's survival became so explosive. Because he was a man who lived in a story where dead men were being turned into heroes. Now, before we turn him into the cartoon villain version of himself, let's talk about what actually happened. When Titanic struck the iceberg on April 14, 1912, Ismay was in his cabin. He later testified that he felt the impact and went out to learn what had happened. He spoke with Captain Smith and was told the ship had struck ice. And like most people on board, he does not seem to have immediately understood just how severe the damage was. As the situation became clearer, Ismay moved around the ship and encouraged passengers to get into lifeboats. Some testimony described him helping load boats and urging people to leave, even as many still did not believe Titanic was truly sinking. He grew more frantic throughout the night until an officer snapped at him to basically step back and let him do his job. And that is one of the complicated things about Ismay's story. There is strong evidence that he helped, or at least tried his best to, all the way to the end. But that is not the version history wanted to remember, and far from what the papers printed. The moment that defined him came with Collapsible C. Collapsible C was on the starboard side of the ship, closer to the bow. By this time, Titanic had developed a rather harsh list to port. This means that actually launching Collapsible C was becoming more dangerous as it was about to lower straight into the side of the ship and not into the water. For this reason, among many, passengers were congregating more on the port side of the ship to get into any remaining boats on that side. This left the decks around Collapsible C basically devoid of people. Honestly tragic. It sounds like people just didn't know that that boat was there. Bruce Ismay brought over some women to the lifeboat and then waited. Upon not seeing any others around, he, along with a few other men, were allowed to board into the lifeboat. Even when questioned, the report stated that if he had not entered the boat, he would merely have added one more life, his own, to the number of those lost. He didn't take the seat of someone else because no one else was around at the time. But that is the inquiry's language. Public opinion has its own language. William Hearst was one of the most powerful newspaper men in the world, and he and Ismay reportedly already disliked each other before Titanic ever sailed. So when Ismay survived the sinking, Hearst Press had the perfect target. A wealthy, powerful man connected to the White Star Line who lived when so many others had died. The Hearst papers helped turn Ismay into the coward of Titanic. He was mocked as J. Brute Ismay. Cartoons showed him abandoning the ship, and some coverage even suggested that the White Star Line flag should be changed to liver yellow, the color of cowardice. While the inquiry could ask careful questions, was there room in the boat? Were other passengers nearby? Did he force his way in? Newspapers could ask a much simpler, crueler question. What kind of man survives when so many women and children die? That question sold papers, and for Ismay, it helped build a reputation he never fully escaped. There were even rumors that he had escaped dressed as a woman, and let's just think about that for a minute. That accusation was not just about whether he got into a lifeboat, it was symbolic demasculation. It took the idea that Ismay had failed as a man and made it literal. The rumor turned his survival into a kind of gender betrayal. Not only did he live, but supposedly he lived by hiding inside womanhood. These were false accusations, of course, but Ismay certainly wasn't the only male survivor who faced stories and accusations like this. Because in the public imagination, male survival needed an explanation. If a man lived, people wanted to know why. Had he helped? Was he ordered in? Was he crew? Was he a young boy? Were they injured? Or had he somehow cheated the code? For women and children, survival was expected. For men, it could become suspicious. And Ismay was the easiest target of all. He was wealthy, powerful, and he was connected to the company. He survived when Captain Smith, Thomas Andrews, and so many others did not. So people did not only ask, did Ismay have a right to live? They asked, what kind of man chooses to live? That's a brutal question. And it reveals more about the culture judging him than it does about the seconds he had to make a decision. Because let's be very clear, criticizing White Star Line is fine. Criticizing the systems that allowed Titanic to sail without enough lifeboats for everyone is fair. Questioning corporate culture, maritime regulations, and the confidence surrounding these giant liners is fair. But turning one surviving man into the entire disaster is something else. Ismay became the place where people put their grief, rage, and moral expectations. He became easier to blame than the outdated lifeboat laws, overconfidence in technology, failures in communication, class inequality, and the chaos of the evacuation.
Because Bruce Ismay was not punished for surviving. He was punished for surviving in a way that did not fit the masculine script. And that script was very clear in 1912. The captain goes down with his ship. The designer dies with his creations. Men step aside and the officers keep order while the women and children are saved. That script gave the disaster meaning. And Ismay disrupted that social script by living, and the public made him pay for that disruption.
He testified at both the American and British inquiries. His actions were examined, questioned, and debated. The British inquiry did not condemn his conduct the way the newspapers did, but by then, the public story had already taken hold. And that is the thing about public shame. It doesn't always wait for facts. After Titanic, Ismay's reputation never fully recovered. He resigned from the presidency of the International Mercantile Marine Company in 1913 and lived a much more private life afterwards. And that is why Ismay fits so perfectly into this question about survivor villainy.
The Duff-Gordons show us how survival could be judged through class, and Bruce Ismay shows us that survival could be judged by ideas of masculinity. His real crime in the public imagination wasn't that he lived, but it was the idea that men like him were supposed to die.
So was J. Bruce Ismay a coward? Or was he a traumatized survivor who became the place where everyone put their anger? Maybe the answer depends on what we are actually judging. If we are judging the White Star Line, the maritime system, and the failures that made the disaster so deadly, then there's plenty to criticize. But if we are judging one human being in one collapsing moment surrounded by fear, confusion, and a ship that was minutes away from disappearing, then maybe the story becomes harder to judge. Because Ismay was powerful, he was privileged, he was connected to the company, and he survived. And he paid for that in the public eye and in the privacy of his own mind, which weighed quite heavy throughout the rest of his life. But Ismay was not the only Titanic survivor whose reputation was shaped by the idea that a man should have died. And that brings us to Masabumi Hosono. Hosono was a Japanese civil servant traveling in second class, and he's generally remembered as the only Japanese passenger on Titanic. What we do have is his own account written after the sinking. And even through imperfect translation, the account does not read like the story of a man casually taking someone else's place. It reads like the story of a confused, frightened survivor trying to understand what was happening in real time. According to the translated version of his account, Hosono had gone to bed around 10 p.m. when he felt what seemed like the ship hitting something. At first, he did not fully grasp what had happened. Then a steward came to his door, told him to get up and go to the deck, and handed him a lifebelt. When Hosono reached the decks, he saw passengers moving in all directions, many already wearing their lifebelts. He asked what had happened, but people didn't seem to know. He was sent back down, then he came back up, returned briefly to his room for his purse and a blanket, and then made his way towards the upper deck where the boats were being lowered. His own account is full of confusion. This was not a neatly organized moment where everyone understood their choices. It was dark and cold, people were being directed and redirected, boats were being lowered, distressed rockets were being fired, and slowly, Hosono realized that Titanic was in serious trouble. In the translation I found, he describes preparing himself for death and being concerned about not doing anything that would bring shame on Japan. Hosono was already thinking about how his actions might be judged. Not just whether he would live, but whether his conduct would be seen as honorable. That is what makes his story so important to this episode. Because here again, survival was not just a physical question, it was a moral one. In his account, he describes seeing boats fill with women and children first. He also describes men attempting to board and being refused. Eventually, when one of the boats was already being lowered, he heard that there was room for 2 more people. Another man jumped in. Hosono says he followed, expecting that he could be shot for it.
That is not a clean hero story, and it's also not a villain story. It's a real, raw story of human survival and literal moments of life and death. A man far from home fears he'll never see his family again and sees one last opportunity to survive and takes it. That decision saved him, but it did not save his reputation or the events that followed.
After Titanic, Hosono's survival became associated with shame. The traditional version of the story says that he was criticized in Japan for surviving when so many others, especially women and children, had died. He was let go from his job initially, though later rehired, I believe. Additional accounts also say his family carried that stigma for years. Because the way people remembered him tells us that male survival from Titanic was not neutral. It had to be explained, it had to be justified. And if the explanation did not satisfy the public, that survivor could become a symbol of failure.
So why did some Titanic survivors become villains while others were allowed to simply be survivors? I think the answer is that survival was never judged equally. The Duff-Gordons survived in a way that looked like privilege. Ismay survived in a way that looked like power protecting itself. And Masabumi Hosono survived in a way that got tangled up in national pride, humility, and honor. They wanted a symbol, and symbols are a lot easier to judge than real people. But maybe we should be careful about turning survivors into villains simply because they survived through something that others did not. Because surviving Titanic did not mean escaping the disaster. These people carried that burden with them for the rest of their lives. So now, I want to know what you think. Are there any true villains in the Titanic story, or are we maybe assigning meaning to something after it happened? I have a tendency to lean towards the latter, but I'm very interested to hear your take on this.